He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Well, as we've heard in this program in recent weeks, health has become an increasingly hot political topic, or to be more precise, the public health system, struggling to meet huge demand within tight budgets as costs surge. On the news, we've seen health professionals making the case for urgent investment and even going on strike over that from time to time. But on screen lately, we've also seen a sudden surge of stuff purporting to show what life at the coalface in health is really like.
In intensive care and in medicine in general, we're healers first, and the most valuable thing we can give our patients is time.
But in the current environment, is this sort of up-close and personal stuff also, inevitably, a bit political? That's later on. But first, every credible broadcaster needs its audience to believe it's going to be fair, balanced and accurate, even when covering the most contested and controversial issues of the day. And that also applies when allowing other people to exercise their own freedom of expression on contentious topics. This week, we look at how two big public broadcasters have been on the back foot lately over the way that they've handled other people's awkward opinions.
You're listening to Morning Report on RNZ National. Police in the UK have launched a criminal investigation into Glastonbury musicians Bob Vylan and Kneecap after reviewing video and audio footage of the performances there. This as duo Bob Vylan had their visas to enter the US revoked because of what the US State Department is calling a hateful tirade at Glastonbury.
That was Ingrid Hipkiss on Morning Report last Monday. And for those not up with the play in popular music these days, Hateful Tirade was not an act performing at the Glastonbury Music Festival, but what the punk rap duo Bob Vylan was accused of delivering on stage last weekend. They chanted "Kill the IDF" and "Free Palestine" during their set, against a backdrop of slogans on a screen accusing the UN of doing too little to stop the killing in Gaza, and also accusing the BBC of minimising it by calling it merely a conflict. And as the whole thing was being broadcast live by the BBC itself at the time, that was awkward, as Ingrid Hipkiss went on to explain on Morning Report.
The BBC says it regrets not cutting away from its live stream of the set on Saturday, calling the group's anti-Israeli comments utterly unacceptable. UK media watchdog Ofcom says it is, quote, very concerned that the broadcast went ahead, that concern also being echoed around the House of Commons.
The controversial Northern Irish act Kneecap also criticised the BBC on stage at Glastonbury. Good luck to the BBC editing all those out, said the singer, acknowledging all the Palestinian flags waving among the crowd as they performed. Though the BBC did see that coming, or something like it. Kneecap has also taken an Israel-critical stance on stage in the past, and band members recently faced charges for allegedly displaying a flag supporting Hezbollah and, allegedly, urging concertgoers to kill members of parliament. The police dropped those charges in the end, but the BBC decided in advance not to stream Kneecap's Glastonbury set live last weekend. But it also didn't put the group's performance up on its on-demand service for fans to watch later on, leading to claims that it had effectively censored the group in response to political pressure. Now, of those Bob Vylan comments that did go out live on the BBC last weekend, the BBC itself did acknowledge they were deeply offensive and anti-Semitic. And the UK government's Culture Secretary later told Parliament this.
On Saturday afternoon, just after the broadcast, I called the Director General to ask for an explanation and what immediate steps the BBC leadership intended to take. It is essential that the BBC explains.
But the critics pointed out that Lisa Nandy's own UK Labour Party has had its own past problems with accusations of anti-Semitism. And if her claim that the Glastonbury broadcast had an enormous impact in the UK, well, critics pointed out that far more upsetting scenes were really being aired by the BBC and others on the news every night from Gaza itself and from Israel. So what's a broadcaster to do when it's committed to covering a major cultural event like Glastonbury live, and some star performers are determined to use the platform to send a message about a controversial issue of public interest? And even when you do attach warning messages about possible discriminatory language and themes coming up, as the BBC did last weekend, it still doesn't take the sting out of it or mean that some people won't be offended. Well, there's no easy answer to those questions, but this past week, the BBC wasn't the only public broadcaster called to account after claims of fostering anti-Semitism. Here's how the ABC's Mediawatch show began last Monday.
Walking from court, victorious.
I was punished for my political opinion.
Antoinette Lattouf winning her public showdown with the public broadcaster.
Welcome to Mediawatch. I'm Linton Besser. And the sorry tale of Antoinette Lattouf arrived at its entirely predictable yet still shocking conclusion last week. With unequivocal findings, the public broadcaster had capitulated to a pro-Israel lobbying campaign and unlawfully jettisoned an on-air presenter who had done nothing wrong.
That tortured tale began 2 years ago when the ABC hired radio presenter Antoinette Lattouf for just 5 days to fill a gap in the summertime. And it did so in spite of a string of social media comments she'd previously made that were highly critical of Israel's military campaign in Gaza. The post that was most discussed in that court case, though, was not her own work. It was a Human Rights Watch message that she shared online, in which the group claimed Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war. And that was a claim which, as Ms. Lattouf's legal team later pointed out, the ABC itself had reported as news at the time, attributed to Human Rights Watch. As soon as Antoinette Lattouf's temporary stint on air began in 2023, complaints to the ABC started to come in from pro-Israel sources, claiming she wasn't fit for on-air duties because of anti-Semitic views, and the complaints clearly had a big impact at the ABC. Long story short, Lattouf was taken off air during her short stint because of this. She challenged it in court, and after a case the ABC spent more than $1 million defending, Lattouf was awarded $70,000 last week for distress caused to her. So what did the ABC actually do wrong? Well, the federal court judge said senior managers of the ABC panicked over those complaints about her. Lattouf's immediate boss at the ABC, Chris Oliver Taylor, told the court that he thought Lattouf had been explicitly instructed not to post anything online concerning the war in Gaza. But the judge reckoned he knew that she had been merely given advice not to do so, and her dismissal was actually motivated, he said, by fear of external criticism.
Mr. Oliver Taylor sought to mitigate the anticipated deluge of complaints and criticism of the ABC. The decision was made to appease the pro-Israel lobbyists, who would inevitably escalate their complaints about the ABC, employing a presenter they perceived to have anti-Semitic and anti-Israel opinions.
The judge also described the evidence of other senior ABC managers as implausible and troubling, and ultimately he found it unconvincing. And while the federal court did not find that the ABC had been motivated in any way by racism, it had wrongly terminated Lattouf's employment on the basis of her holding a political opinion. And on the ABC's Mediawatch show this week, host Linton Besser said it's critical that ABC top brass do show more backbone when challenged from now on.
The public broadcaster has been repeatedly buffeted off course by members of its board going weak-kneed before the gripes of the persistent and the powerful, even when those complaints have very little, if any, merit. Surely that must end now.
But the question of what presenters can and can't say in a personal capacity isn't so clear. While the federal court decided Antoinette Lattouf's social media activity wasn't grounds for her dismissal, the critical point was the rather narrow one of whether she had disobeyed a specific instruction not to put her views online. And the court also said that Antoinette Lattouf posting that Human Rights Watch comment was ill-advised and inconsiderate to her employer, the ABC. One who watched the court deliver that ruling last week was Dr. Dennis Muller, who cut his teeth on newspapers in Auckland 50 years ago before becoming an editor at the Sydney Morning Herald and running investigative journalism at Melbourne's main daily, The Age. He's now a fellow at the University of Melbourne's Centre for Advancing Journalism and, along with fellow Kiwi and former ABC host Nicole Shevastik, co-hosts the weekly podcast Truth, Lies and Media. And this week, no prizes for guessing what that was all about.
This was an extraordinary win for Lattouf and an extraordinary setback for the ABC, because the court also found that the ABC made this decision under extreme pressure.
And Dennis Muller told me this week that pressure he was talking about there is something that often doesn't reach the public.
It was on a very intense email campaign directed really at two people, the chair at the time and the then managing director and editor-in-chief, David Anderson. And this intense email campaign came from the pro-Israel lobby, and it included a group called Lawyers for Israel, and they threatened legal action against the ABC if Lattouf wasn't removed. And there were leaks to the Australian newspaper, which intensified the pressure even further. The ABC management fell into what the federal court called a state of panic. And so the management found a way to sack her. They said that she disobeyed what they called a direction not to post anything controversial, but in fact the court found it was just a suggestion.
Well, this story's clearly been a big one for the media, including the ABC itself having to report on its own drama. And I wonder what the effect on the public's been.
This is from Jackie in Brisbane. What is also concerning is that pro-Israel lobbyists have had access to the ear of ABC upper management. Ordinary Australians can only make a complaint online.
That was on the Radio National Breakfast Show. The normal complaints process, if there's been an unfairness or whatever, is to formally complain. The broadcaster will look at it, uphold it or not. The fact of lobbyists going straight to the top tier of management and getting that response, I mean, that should be the worry, shouldn't it?
Yeah, you would think, wouldn't you? But in recent years, the ABC has developed a habit of just caving in to pressure. And I suppose the most celebrated example of it was the treatment of Stan Grant after the coronation of King Charles III, where he was asked about the impact of the monarchy in Australia. And he said, well, they took our land. Again, it brought the wrath of News Corporation through the Australian newspaper. It brought down on the ABC's head the wrath of monarchists and of conservatives generally. And the ABC walked away from him. And in the end, he just walked away from them.
Yeah, Stan Grant was here in New Zealand recently, gave a long interview to our Television New Zealand Q&A show. I mean, he was clearly very deeply affected by it. He's got an Indigenous Australian heritage. It's a really bad situation, isn't it? If someone with his profile is saying, I was not protected from this kind of hostile attack by my own employer.
Yeah, and he said it when he was a panellist on the coverage of the coronation. He wasn't there as a reporter. He'd been invited as a commentator. He was simply doing what the ABC had asked him to do, to make comment on the coronation. Good editors absorb that stuff because it's part of their duty to create a safe place within which their staff can do good journalism without looking over their shoulder every 5 minutes to see if some vested interest is going to come after them.
Well, you talked about that actually in your own podcast last week. You recall working at those newspapers, feeling the pressure yourself, like questioning in your own head, is that person who might have Indigenous Australian heritage the right person to be reporting the story? That person's a big trade unionist. Are they going to report this fairly? So you've had to deal with that personally, right?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I did. Can that person be relied on to report on their community or on that event? Back in those days, I just resolved it by waiting to see what they would produce. And I've never regretted that. That if you go down the other route, I mean, you get into the situation of saying, well, can a Palestinian journalist be trusted to report on the Gaza war? Can a Jewish journalist? I think once you get onto that slippery slope, you're in very dangerous territory. You're making judgments about people's character and professional capabilities arbitrarily and on the basis of your own prejudice.
Well, this is the social media age now, Dennis, and I think that complicates things. And you wrote that it leaves unresolved the question of the extent to which a media organisation is entitled to place restrictions on a staff journalist's private activities in order to protect its own interests and reputation. So you also noted the new director of the ABC, managing director Hugh Marks, has said policies on private use of social media by staff have been reviewed and will be replaced with new guidelines. What do those new guidelines need to say in order to make sure this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, it's something that present guidelines do need reviewing. I mean, they're contradictory, they're imprecise, they're open to arbitrary interpretation and enforcement. For instance, they define a breach as occurring when a journalist's private social media content, quote, could reasonably be considered to breach the ABC's guidelines. Well, reasonably considered by whom? by an ABC executive, by Lawyers for Israel? Come on, we need to have something more precise than that. What evidence is needed to support some reasonable belief? It talks about a political reporter expressing, quote, a strong personal opinion on a contentious issue on their own private media. Well, what's strong? What's contentious? By whose criteria? It talks about perceptions of impartiality. Well, whose perceptions? Those of a lobby group? On what evidence is a perception considered to exist? And what they don't have are any sort of firm red lines. And I reckon there are a couple you can start with. I mean, one is a journalist who's covering a story should not be using his or her social media to comment on that story. I think that's absolutely obvious. And second, when they do comment, they should refrain from using hate speech, incitement, crude speech, personal attacks, because that does tend to bring not just the journalist, but the people they work for into disrepute. So I think those are two absolute red lines. After that, I think you've got to have a pretty wide latitude for journalists to be able to engage as private citizens in public debate. There's no need to go that far in order to protect your reputation.
But you don't always know what you're going to be covering as a journalist in a news organisation in the very near future. So you might have made comment about individuals or issues that you later end up reporting on, as I guess lobbyists who complained about Antoinette Lattouf feared she might.
But once you've been assigned to the story, that's the cut-off point, isn't it? I mean, and I think, look, a lot of journalists who are, say, reporting in politics all the time, a good professional journalist is not going to engage in debate about issues in federal politics if they're reporting federal politics all the time. If you try to impose vague, imprecise rules around these things, you basically don't solve the problem.
And finally, Dennis, it is a coincidence, but the BBC also this week found itself in the gun apologising for broadcasting anti-Israel comments made by performers at the Glastonbury Music Festival. You've even had the UK government, the Culture Secretary, saying she'd been in touch with the Director General demanding to know what happened and what's being done about it. Does that feel sort of fair and appropriate to you?
I think the BBC dug a hole for itself with this, because it doesn't look as though they had a delay on the live stream. I mean, on live-to-air radio, we have a 10-second delay and what's called a dump button. And if someone says something, you've got 10 seconds to dump it and prevent it going to air. But I think the problem was the reference to effing Zionists. I mean, that is definitely anti-Semitic and should not have been broadcast. And the problem with that is that once someone's got a sort of crack in the dam, as it were, the dam wall can break, and then you open yourself up to this flood of criticisms, which to a large extent are not justified. I mean, it was for the rapper Bob Dylan to chant "Death to the Israeli Defense Force" is definitely anti-Israel, but conventionally that's not regarded as being anti-Semitic.
I'm just thinking, wouldn't it be just about the worst job in modern media to be hovering with a finger over a button during the live performance, multi-camera of something like Glastonbury over days and days and days, anticipating when there may possibly be contentious and abusive comment made about an issue of major public controversy?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't like to be that person, but on live radio, the producer is sitting there. They would have had some sort of delay system. We're living in pretty febrile times, talking about Israel and the Gaza war. This is an occasion to have a delay system going. That would be my view.
That was Dr. Dennis Muller, a New Zealander who was formerly an editor at the Sydney Morning Herald and Melbourne's daily paper The Age. He's now a fellow at the University of Melbourne's Centre for Advancing Journalism, and he co-hosts the weekly podcast Truth, Lies and Media with fellow New Zealander and ABC Australia presenter Nicole Shavastik. That's available on all major podcast platforms, and that latest episode, all about the ABC's Lattouf affair fallout, is called Consternation and Panic. 2 words the federal court judge used last week to describe the ABC boss's reaction that prompted their big problem. Recently here on Mediawatch, we looked at debate in the media about the pros and cons of private and public provision of elective surgery, and that was after the government instructed Health New Zealand to do long-term deals with private health providers for it. And one of the cons, according to Sarah Dalton of the Senior Doctors Union, the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists, was this.
It may be the answer or a partial answer for some surgeries in some places, but you have to remember that there aren't private hospitals in all parts of New Zealand, and we are concerned about equity of access to care.
And last week, a report tabled in Parliament by the Auditor-General John Ryan raised that same issue.
Access to the private hospitals that provide outsourced treatment is not equally distributed across the country. This means that some districts can outsource patients more easily and at shorter notice than others.
The Otago Daily Times editorial last Monday echoed that too, under the headline, Fastest Treatment Not Always the Fairest. And during the Prime Minister's round of media interviews that same morning, the Herald Now host Ryan Bridge asked Christopher Luxon about that, like this.
John Ryan, Auditor General's report, postcode lottery alive and well. Are you happy with that?
Well, it just confirms what New Zealanders know, taking too long to get services, and certainly there's some variation across the country, and that's why we're working hard. We've put more money in, we're hiring more, we've got clear targets, and now we've got to get delivery.
Also, that your changes that you're making, outsourcing to private, will make that worse.
Rubbish, absolute rubbish.
How can you say that, though, when you don't have the same private hospital capacity in Northland as you have in Auckland?
But Christopher Luxon went on to insist that the potential increase in inequity was essentially just a detail at this point in time.
Depending on where you are in the country, there'll be different private hospital capacity.
Sure.
So you are exacerbating the postcode lottery.
Well, we can have that intellectual conversation, but more importantly...
Well, it's not intellectual, is it? When you're living in Northland and can't go to a private hospital?
No, I'm saying...
Is it intellectual for those people?
I'm acknowledging that that is the case, but I'm also saying when you've got tens of thousands of people who actually could be helped across the country, I appreciate it's not even. There are variations across the country.
Okay, so
however, this wasn't merely an intellectual debate, according to one young doctor who also talked about it on 9 to Noon this week.
The private system is not doing all these extra surgeries because they're somehow more efficient or greater, or there's some spare capacity that's being used. It's because we're paying a premium to have extra operating days on the weekend where these people on waiting lists are operated on. And these premiums are not being paid by insurance companies or anything, it's being paid by the government. So in essence, and the government is paying extra money, investing in more surgeries being done, which is not kind of too antithetical to what we're asking for, which is really more funding and more investment to get things done. But I do think that because the cost of an operation per patient is more expensive in the private system than the public system, I do think that extra money that we're investing to get those lists shorter is probably more better used and more efficient, being just invested into creating a better public system.
That was Dr. Ivor Popovic, an intensive care fellow at Middlemore Hospital and the author of the just-published book, A Dim Prognosis, Our Health System in Crisis, and A Doctor's View on How to Fix It. Now, doctors in the system don't often speak out like this, something paediatrician Dr. Renee Liang explored this week in her regular column for the website of North and South magazine, which is currently on hiatus as a printed product, according to the publishers. Using a private online forum for health workers, Dr. Liang asked 2 questions.
1, would you feel comfortable speaking to media about important health issues that you're expert in? 2, do you feel that explicitly or implicitly clinicians are being discouraged from making public comment?
And within hours, she wrote, replies of no and yes, respectively, poured in. Worrying stuff, and more about that in a minute. But lately, there have been a few efforts to show us what it's really like to work in the health system on our screens.
We see things a bit differently.
You're doing the pampering sessions.
I love it.
We're not doing the easiest of jobs.
That's Hospice Heroes, a new fly-on-the-wall series that begins this weekend on 3. In The Listener, reviewer Russell Brown said that the series focuses on the carers and the dying and not the politics of palliative care. Things like, for example, the pay equity agreement that hospice workers thought they nearly had until the rules changed suddenly by law under urgency in May. And last week, the 5-part TV series Diary of a Junior Doctor wrapped up on TVNZ1, featuring some fairly hair-raising life and death episodes.
What have we got coming in?
A 24-year-old male, RTC high speech.
Nata, keep your arms across your chest for us, mate.
Yeah, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Really still for me, mate, okay?
Can we give him some more analgesia, please?
When that series kicked off, Christchurch Daily The Press said it showed us how the health system keeps running in the face of staff shortages and long hours.
There's so much noise in the media about the state of the health system that you could be forgiven for thinking that this might be a politically charged declaration of war against the state for not properly looking after patients or health professionals, or our crumbling infrastructure. But it is not that.
But something that was that would not likely be funded publicly by New Zealand On Air, as that series was. Recently, the press also highlighted another series featuring 8 doctors, also juggling heavy and unpredictable workloads.
The specialty I've chosen has 50% night shifts. You miss sleep, you ask your adrenaline and cortisol to keep you running at 4 o'clock in the morning to do strange things that it's not supposed to do. In intensive care and in medicine in general, we're healers first, and the most valuable thing we can give our patients is time.
That was a recent episode of I Am a Doctor, featuring Dr. Kat Foster, an ICU registrar in Christchurch. And like TVNZ's Diary of a Junior Doctor, it shows us also how Kat unwinds when she can with her dog.
Mrs. Tiggy Winkle? I did not name her. I feel it's important to say. We just call her Tig. It reminds me that there's life outside of the hospital and that what I do is to facilitate life, not illness. I keep coming back for the humanity. I get the privilege of working with vulnerable people, making them feel better, and it draws me back.
But these personal doctor stories are a lot shorter than Diary of a Junior Doctor and not for TV. They're on the website iamadoctor.nz, published and funded by the Resident Doctors Association of New Zealand. The union itself is not bad at social media video. When resident doctors were on strike a year ago, it posted videos like this one.
Despite these challenges, I remain incredibly optimistic. Our resolve is not breaking, and in fact our membership is growing, and so I remain optimistic that we will be able to get a good deal, that we'll be able to fix these problems, and we'll be able to keep looking after the people of New Zealand.
That's the Resident Doctors Association President Rosa Tobin-Stickings speaking to camera on the streets during a strike last year. So this week I asked her, what exactly is the purpose of the union's self-funded short documentary videos that they're now promoting?
Look, I think we wanted to do something positive because I think we're all aware of how challenging healthcare is at the moment. And we wanted to do something that celebrated us as a profession and also valued what we do. And a big goal of it is to sort of let the public see behind the curtain.
You are a union, so is it also about a bit of pressure to get the public on side or maybe even decision makers? Health is such a hot topic right now. Kind of no coincidence that these are being released at this particular moment?
I think actually this project was sort of getting off the ground last year before lots of the stuff that's quite in the press as we speak was coming about. And, our goal isn't to sort of sway the public behind us or anything, but definitely to educate them about who we are. And I think if the public see what we do and then have, positive feelings towards us, that's a great byproduct of that. Mostly it was about just trying to educate them about who we are and what we do, which is definitely a slightly different tack from what our usual business as a union is.
It's not documentary, it's not journalism as such, it is a bit of public relations, I guess. They're all very admirable, very nice people and presented as such, and I'm not going to say that any of them aren't or anything like that. But, there must be grumpy, irascible people who aren't necessarily present that well in the health system. Does this give a bit of a rose-tinted view of what registered doctors are really like?
In any profession, no matter what that is, there will be people who are grumpy and irascible, as you say, but most people who go into medicine have a motivation to try and help people and generally are actually pretty all right people. And I think this documentary series does capture that. And obviously we weren't going to focus on, Grumpy George in the corner who's having a miserable time, because that wouldn't make a very good series.
No. Just trying to think if we did the same for journalism, Yeah, I can think of a few individuals I probably wouldn't handpick to represent the profession at its best. I might include myself in that. It's not the only kind of video project right now giving people a sense of what life is like for the people who are right at the coalface. I mean, just this weekend, a series called Hospice Heroes is just getting underway, and The Diary of a Junior Doctor on TVNZ1. And that followed, I think, 6 junior doctors at Middlemore Hospital. I'm guessing you would have seen that and watched that one with interest?
Yes, I've seen that series. I haven't seen the last episode of it, but I've seen the other 3 and definitely watched it with interest. I've worked at Middlemore myself. Lots of my colleagues are watching it as well.
And do you think that gave a good and reliable picture of what life is like in hospitals around the country?
It sort of gives the general public a deeper understanding of the challenges we face and the pressures we face day to day. And I think and to see those struggles, yeah.
And some of the reviews were quite interesting of the programs and the articles about them, those TV series. For example, the one about Hospice Heroes that hasn't screened yet, but in an article about it in The Listener, say, look, one thing that's not in the program but is relevant is the pay equity issues. So a lot of hospice carers might have had a pay equity claim that was pretty close to resolution. Now that's been scratched and they're not paid as well as people who work in hospitals. And a write-up of The Diary of a Junior Doctor said, I was expecting to see a bit more of the stress and tension, the limited budgets, the anger about things. And that's not there as well. And I guess in programs that are publicly funded via New Zealand On Air, that would be deemed to be a bit political.
Yeah, I think it is a fine line to walk. Amongst medical professionals, there can be a bit of a fear about speaking out about those things. You don't see people talking about those political issues so much on these shows. And also, I guess it depends. I don't know who made those shows in particular and what their actual aims and goals were. But yes, I think it is challenging to speak out politically and be sort of a front-facing person as a healthcare professional at the moment, yeah. It can be frustrating in healthcare when you want to tell your story and be like, this is why it's like this, and you're not seeing that presented necessarily. But I don't think that was the goal of that series in general. Mostly I found myself empathising with the doctors who are on that show and what they're going through, because we've all been there and we've all had similar experiences to those.
There was an interesting article about that published by North and South magazine on its website. It begins like this. It says, one of the main jobs doctors have is to advocate for health. Hands up, who agrees? You all have your hands up, right?
We, at med school, you're taught that you're an advocate, whether that's for your patient in front of you, so advocating for their health, or the health of wider populations, whether that's the individual or whether that's something systemic like an attack on public health care or staffing issues, then, we are allowed to speak out and advocate to try and improve our public healthcare system. I've read that article, Dr. Liang's article. It's not surprising to me to see that, but it is concerning. Doctors are afraid to speak out. I think from a resident doctor's point of view, we're often afraid of career retribution. That if we speak out, we won't get onto a particular training program, or we won't get the desired job we want, or we'll get bad references. But it's actually quite scary to see our seniors, our specialists, who are facing the same pressure. By doing things like I'm a Doctor or The Diary of a Junior Doctor, hopefully the public can see that what we do has been backed up by years of dedication and training. It is a bit pervasive at the moment, but as I say, we do have a role and an obligation to speak out to try and protect our patients' safety.
When journalists ask for comment, that's a different story. And Dr. Liang also covered that in the article. She says in it, a journalist I know commented that she found it really hard to get any comment from doctors, even anonymously. And she says, surely answering a media question about what's needed for better health, shouldn't be a political or a party political issue. And then she goes on to say, the same journalist told me after she'd interviewed a health worker in their role as a union delegate, the worker was called into a please explain meeting at the hospital. This was so unpleasant, the worker refused to speak to any journalist for months. That's one case, I guess, and one anecdote, but that is very concerning, isn't it? Even if anonymous, even if communicate with the journalist when the journalist asks for information.
It's a terrible story that someone who's in the role of a union representative who's been so put off speaking that they don't speak to the media.
But that's the position you're in, right? You're a union rep yourself.
Yeah, that's right. From my point of view, anytime I've been interviewed by the media about things, and often it's been around strike action and contract negotiations, so definitely testy issues, I haven't had any retribution. And I would say that we are protected as union representatives when it comes to speaking out. But we want to make it so that people aren't afraid of talking to the media about things that they are concerned about or things that they have specialist knowledge about.
And finally, going back to the I Am a Doctor video series, I mean, they are short, they are personal. Would you consider making more pointed kind of campaign videos using actual medical personnel like the 8 featured and saying, look, we can't do our jobs properly because of X, Y, Z, or these are the things we feel we need, and make actually more direct kind of campaign messages like that?
The I Am a Doctor campaign is a pretty specific thing, but it depends on what comes up in the future about how we go about communicating with the public and what we feel is the best way to do that, whether that's just through traditional media and, you know, talking to radio, TV, all that sort of stuff, or whether it's a different campaign that will depend on the issue ahead of us, I think.
And would you say articles like the one that Dr. Renee Liang wrote this week are pretty helpful because they're saying perhaps the sorts of things that doctors find really hard to say? Because, I mean, apart from her own byline on the story, there's only one other medical professional who gave her name for it. And there's lots of comments and quotes from people who felt they can't.
Yeah, I think it's really good that people like Renee Liang can continue to write their columns. So, you know, I'm glad she's written an article shining a light on these issues.
There was Dr. Rosa Tobin-Stickings, president of the New Zealand Registered Doctors Association, which put out its own series of videos showing life as a doctor in the health system today. They're on the website iamadoctor, all one word, .nz. Now, other fly-on-the-wall type series that we mentioned there, Hospice Heroes, screens every week on Sunday night on 3 and on demand on 3 Now, and Diary of a Junior Doctor, which has just finished its run on TVNZ1, is now available in full on TVNZ+. Last week on Midweek Mediawatch, our weekly catch-up with Nights on RNZ National every Wednesday, we looked at how Deputy Prime Minister David Seymour ramped up friction with the news media with a fundraising appeal. The days of reporting facts and letting Kiwis make up their own minds are long gone, he declared, and the media had abused their power to edit what they were told, he said. I need your support to go around the media and speak directly to New Zealanders, David Seymour said to supporters, promoting ACT's YouTube channel as the place to hear his party's politicians talk unedited. Now, Nick Mills, the host of News Talk ZB's Wellington Morning Show, is also a believer in letting politicians speak live and uncut, and this week, another political party leader on his show aired some grievances about the media and fairness.
We don't ever hear of ram raids anymore. Is that because of the system that you put in place, or is it since the coalition's come in?
No, it's because your Tory owners at NZME have just decided not to put it on the front page anymore. It's still happening. It's just NZME have decided that it's not in the government's best interests, and they do the National Party's singing for them, so they're not covering it as much anymore.
Oh, gosh, that's a bit tough to
Well, that was indeed a bit tough from Chris Hipkins. NZME publishes The Herald and owns News Talk ZB. But he was backed up by his party colleague Willie Jackson MP, who said NZME twists things, the New Zealand Herald are right-wing ratbags, and ZB are the worst. But was it even true about the ram raids? Well, later, on News Talk ZB's Drive show, the question was put to the Herald's political editor, Thomas Coughlin.
So in 2022, we were having about 59 ram raids a month. So 2022, the last year, full year of the Labour government, 714 ram raids that year. Now we've had 45 ram raids total this year, about 9 ram raids a month for each month that we have data. So, but I would imagine the reason why there aren't so many ram raids on the front page is that there are just far fewer ram raids.
So, far fewer ram raids, which is good. But what about those Tory owners supposedly directing the Herald and News Talk ZB?
The government's not perfect, but one area...
But you would say that to defend your Tory owners, wouldn't you?
Say that.
Wouldn't you?
Yes, we're also... we're a publicly traded company, so many people own stocks in NZME, and I'm sure some of them are Tories and some of them are not Tories. It is part of being a listed company.
Okay.
And that's a good point. Who owns the shares and what they want from them has also been hotly debated lately, both before and after a bitter battle for control of the NZME boardroom. And while it is true that there were ram raid reports aplenty in the media in 2022 and 2023, it's not as if there weren't plenty of them in media outlets other than the Herald and News Talk ZB. And after the Herald's Thomas Coughlan drove a Suzuki Swift through the notion that reports on ram raids could have been driven by political interference, ZB Drive host Heather Duplessis-Allen pointed out that Chris Hipkins is far from the first finger-pointing political party leader to attack the media like this.
Parties across the spectrum have been doing it. Jacinda pulled out of the interviews with Mike. You've had New Zealand First deliberately trying to bait RNZ into arguments. You've had ACT refusing to go on Morning Report. You've had now the Labour Party have a crack at NZME. Like, it feels to me like it suits. You're certainly seeing enough of it for me to think that it could potentially be a strategy to have a crack at whichever media organisation you feel is your enemy.
I certainly agree. To me, it always feels like blaming the ref. And now, obviously, you know, refs do get things wrong, the media gets things wrong, but everyone knows that it's usually not the ref that causes a game to go one way or the other.
Another good point there from Thomas Coughlan. But everyone in the media, from Thomas Coughlan and his parliamentary press gallery peers to the folks in the sports department, also know that referee blaming can also be good copy and great talk radio fodder in these days when engagement is the real name of the game in the media. Well, that's it for this weekend. Thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X. And you can even write us an old-fashioned letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. I'll be back next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.